AJ Terrell has earned a contract extension, but the Falcons might hesitate to pay it if the price ain't right.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka Mr. AKA. And of course, I've been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer, and make sure to become an everydayer. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available as your first listen or first watch of the day. In today's episode, we are continuing our positional breakdowns of each defense of play, talking about the cornerbacks. We'll look ahead to the offseason to see if the Falcons are going to be able to upgrade their quarterback play by addressing one of the two main issues that they're going to have to deal with, which is the first one being, do they pay AJ Terrell, and do they stop the revolving door in terms of who's going to start opposite AJ Terrell at that outside cornerback spot. And we'll talk about the Falcons paying AJ Terrell starting off, right? You know, given it's about to be year 5 for AJ Terrell after he got that 5th-year option 2 off seasons ago, right? And we saw Chris Lindstrom going into his 5th year last offseason get his big extension. So the time might be right for paying AJ Terrell, right? He's due. But the question is, should the Falcons pay AJ Terrell this offseason? I think the answer is yes, but it kind of depends on the price tag, right? You may recall the episode we did with Josh Kendall of The Athletic last year after the Falcons paid Lindstrom and asked him, is AJ Terrell next? And he said he didn't think the team was there yet. And hopefully we'll have Josh on the podcast soon enough and we can revisit that topic. But I can certainly understand why people may be a little more hesitant to give that big contract extension to AJ Terrell this offseason, given the perception that he's coming off a bad year. Now, I don't think he is coming off a bad year, but there were some struggles this past year, right? In charting the defense myself, you know, I think it basically boils down to he gave up too many explosive plays this year. I counted 11 receptions of 20 or more yards allowed by AJ Terrell this year. Now, he had more in his rookie season when he had 13 of those plays, but you look at the last 2 seasons in 2021 and 2022 combined, he only gave up 11 explosive plays in those 2 years combined. So as many as the last 2 seasons combined. Now, in all 3 years, 21, 22, and 23, he gave up only 3 of those explosive plays in man coverage, but 8 this past year came in zone. And a bunch of those were touchdowns. And that's why the perception is that, you know, cornerbacks get beat. And when you get beat like AJ Terrell did on a couple of those plays, it sticks in your mind, right? Now, a couple of them, you know, he did give up a 4th touchdown in zone coverage this year on an 18-yarder to A.T. Perry in that week 18 matchup where Perry was able to use his size to kind of box him out on a back shoulder fade. And that was kind of the through line with a lot of the explosive touchdowns that AJ gave up this year, right? Mike Evans beat him on a 40-yard touchdown earlier in the season where he was able to sort of lean on him to create that little separation at the top of the route, right? You had the no call on DeAndre Hopkins in that Titans game where Hopkins not being as big as Mike Evans and A.T. Perry, but certainly was very physical in that particular play, right? Now, the other touchdown that he gave up was a blown coverage in that Ridley game or in that Jacksonville game to Calvin Ridley, right? And there was a couple other mental errors where they gave up a big play to DJ Moore in week 17 against the Bears where he had his eyes too stuck in the backfield, right? So a couple of mental errors, a couple other big plays that were mental errors. And so, you know, by my account, it's about 5 sort of explosives that were mental mistakes or whatever, blown coverages. And those are things that we can clean up if AJ can be a little bit more disciplined under this new regime with hopefully, you know, improved coaching on the secondary level. But the other issues where, you know, Mike Evans and Hopkins and Perry is like, that's kind of been a through line of AJ Terrell throughout his career. We've talked about that a ton on the podcast where, like, when you look at the games where he's had his toughest matchups, whether you're talking about Jamar Chase in the national championship game, or Mike Evans, Michael Thomas, A.T. Perry, Hopkins, right? It's the physical guys that tend to give A.J. Terrell the most problems. He struggles against size and physicality, right? That just may be who he is. And when you look ahead to 2024, this upcoming season, you look at, hey, you circle that matchup against Philadelphia and A.J. Brown, where you're like, oh, that could be a problem, right? Maybe it's also a problem against Devontae Adams, George Pickens, Mike Evans, if he's back in Tampa Bay. DK Metcalf, maybe? Well, he did pretty good against DK back in 2022. But it's potentially like you just have to accept the fact that there's going to be 3 or 4 games with AJ Terrell where his issues against physicality might be an issue. And to me, when it comes to the decision to pay AJ Terrell, it's like, okay, how much is the quote unquote peace of mind for the other 13 to 14 games where it's a non-issue worth it to you? Is that worth $19.5 million a year, which is slightly more than what Trevon Diggs signed this past summer? Is that worth $20 million a year? Is that worth more or less? I can certainly understand why, we can balk at the idea of paying him $22 million a year, which would make him the highest paid corner in the NFL over Jair Alexander, who's making $21 million a year. But to me, having peace of mind for like 80% of your games or more, I got no problem paying, 20, 19, 20, something like that. Your mileage may vary. So I'd love to hear you guys' feedback on sort of where you sort of stack in that when it comes to paying AJ. Would you wait a year? Right? Do you let it play out another year and then decide? AJ's cap hit this year is only $12.3 million. So that's doable. That's not an egregious cap hit, right? There's no pressure for you to have to do an extension to lower that number, which is why one of the reasons why you do an extension to lower that cap hit. But, you do wonder if you let that play out, what happens next offseason when he's a free agent? Because you have another decision that affects next offseason's free agency, which is, does Kyle Pitts get a 5th-year option? Right. And if you let both Terrell play out his year and you give that, and you don't do a 5th-year option for Kyle Pitts this offseason, then they're both going to be free agents next year, and you'll got one franchise tag to go around, and you might want to keep both of those guys a year from now. Now, of course, if you give Kyle Pitts the 5th-year option, then he's signed through the 2025 season, and that mitigates that issue. And I'm sitting here today, I think the Falcons will, extend that 5th-year option for Kyle Pitts, but it's not as big a slam dunk as it has been in previous years with AJ Terrell and Chris Lindstrom, when you're like, oh, they're definitely doing that. There's a little bit of debate, but that will be probably something that we can explore potentially with Josh Kendall next time he's on the podcast. But, we'll leave AJ Terrell's contract situation aside. We'll look at the spot opposite him, where we've seen a different starter every single year of AJ Terrell's career. And will we see another one, a new starter in 2024? Will Jeff Okudah return? Is Clark Phillips the guy that can start there? Or do we need to go shopping for somebody else? We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further, or ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and escapes. It's the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure, and I can attest to this because I drove a Nissan Rogue for my rental car last week in Mobile, Alabama. It's a smooth ride. It's got great features. All those NFL insiders like Tom Pelissero were like commenting on the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system, where you no longer need your phone to connect with Google Assistant, Google Maps, Google Play. It's built right in. All right. And of course, those NFL insiders were like, what else does Nissan offer? Well, they got the incredible lineup that includes the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder. It's room up to 8. You can fit all the insiders into one expansive cargo capacity, 284 horsepower, all that more. So take the Nissan Rogue, the Pathfinder, or the Nissan Armada to give your next big adventure, to go find your next big adventure. Shop nissanusa.com. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 streaming channel, the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel here on YouTube, giving you the biggest stories across the globe from the local experts, as well as the national shows covering every league. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, their 24/7 streaming channel. Locked On Sports Today's channel is available on YouTube and Amazon Fire TV. Now, what about the revolving door opposite AJ Terrell, right? We need to find a doorstop, right? It started out with Darqueze Dennard in 2020, Fabian Moreau the next year, Casey Hayward in 22. Jeff Okudah was supposed to be that problem solver, that doorstop in 2023. Wasn't necessarily the case, right? Are we going to find that player in 2024? Hopefully the answer to that question is yes. But, you wonder, is that solution currently on the roster? I don't know, right? That leads us to a conversation about Jeff Okudah versus Clark Phillips. I think Jeff Okudah is more likely to be that guy, but we'll break it down, right? And Okudah had a pretty good first half of the season, right? In terms of being that doorstop, that door jam, whatever you want to call it. Unlike Terrell, he wasn't giving up explosive plays in the first 8 games, right? He only gave up one 20-plus yard play in the first 8 games of the season. Then he gave up 2 in the Vikings game. Then he gave up another one to Trey McBride against Arizona. Then Olave got him after the bye week. Then he gave up 3 to Gibson and Garrett Wilson against that Jets. And then he got hurt at the end of that Jets game, missed the game, then gave up another explosive play to Jonathan Mingo on the game-winning drive against the Panthers. And you heard me say things, at the end of the season, like, I don't get why we benched Jeff Okudah. And like looking back at the numbers, I'm like, oh, I get it now, right? He had a very rough 4-game stretch in November. Then he got hurt at the beginning of December and basically never bounced back. So Okudah wound up finishing with 1 less explosive play allowed than AJ Terrell with 10, right? 8 of those coming in the month of November. And when you consider that Okudah overall had 30 less targets than AJ Terrell, it's a pretty stark difference. It was a very bad November. Now, the guy that replaced him after his injury was Clark Phillips. And Clark Phillips didn't give up any explosive plays until the Week 18 finale, where he got beat by A.T. Perry and Chris Olave for some explosive plays. Now, can we say because of that, is Clark Phillips less prone to giving explosive plays? Again, it's hard to know, right? He only gave up 2 in 5 games. But then again, as I mentioned, Jeff Okudah only gave up 1 in his first 8 games. And would Clark Phillips have given up more had he had a bigger sample size? Who knows? We can only speculate. Now, Phillips, of course, had that signature performance in Week 14 where he allowed no catches on 5 targets going up against Chris Godwin. But Jeff Okudah had a similar game in Week 7 against Godwin where he only allowed 1 2-yard catch on 4 targets. And watching the film, it felt like in both of those games, it was less about their lockdown coverage and more about just, some drops and some missed throws. But what did stand out on film watching Clark Phillips was how much better he was in zone coverage than Jeff Okudah was, right? Okudah was more that man matchup guy, right, due to his superior size, length, and speed. But Phillips has that discipline and much more comfort playing in the zone. And when you look at success rate allowed in terms of successful plays on targeted throws, Phillips was the best on the team in zone coverage this year. He also had the highest forced incompletion rate in zone coverage this year based off my charting. And what a forced incompletion for me is basically any pass there's an incompletion and the cause of that wasn't deemed to be quarterback or wide receiver error or a pass broken up by another defender like a batted ball or something like that. And Phillips had a 16% forced incompletion rate against zone. AJ Terrell was 15%. Jeff Okudah was way down at 6, only in zone. Now, when you factor all plays, man and zone, Terrell led the team with 16%. Phillips was 12%. D. Alford was right behind him at 11%. Richie Grant was 9%. Jesse Bates was 7%, and Okudah was 7%. Now, I think in a zone-heavy scheme, Phillips showed he can be a serviceable, emphasis on serviceable starter. But I think when you play in a scheme that wants to play man coverage, as so many do, that's where Phillips' shortcomings come, right? He had 5 coverage penalties, all coming in man coverage. Now, you can sit there and say, well, AJ Terrell had 6 coverage penalties and Okudah had 4, so what's the big deal? Well, those guys played a lot more snaps than Clark Phillips did. And so basically Clark Phillips is 2 times more prone to getting penalized in coverage than either one of those 2 guys. And then when you just only focus on the man coverage snaps, it's more like 3 times as more prone than AJ Terrell and 8 times more prone to a penalty than Jeff Okudah was. And then there's the tackling with Clark Phillips, right? He struggled there, right? He was 15th percentile among cornerbacks, according to Pro Football Focus, in terms of missed tackle rates, 15 being bad, not high. Jeff Okudah, meanwhile, was the opposite, 82nd percentile. He's a very good tackling corner. D. Alford, 42nd percentile, AJ Terrell, 37th. So below average tacklers, but at least closer to league average than Clark Phillips. And that's one of the things we talked about with Clark Phillips. He has to be better as a tackler if he's going to earn and deserve more playing time. Now, I think the Falcons can do better at that outside cornerback spot. And we'll see what the new scheme wants to do with Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake coming in here. And they'll probably want to play more zone. The Rams, under the past 3 years, under Morris calling plays, have been one of these zone heaviest defenses in the NFL. Although from what I understand, I haven't really done a deep dive, but I've done some research and read some things. right? Like the Falcons this past year, a lot of their zone the last couple of years has been more of that zone match coverage, which is, it turns into man coverage when a guy comes into your zone. But the thing I also read about Raheem Morris and his time in the Rams is he's going to adjust his scheme and to his personnel. And a lot of it also had to deal with how the Rams offense played, from what I've gathered, right? We talked about this with Dean Pease, how Dean Pease tended to play a bend but don't break defense because the Falcons offense in 2021 and 2022 didn't have the firepower to score a lot of points, and they couldn't play from behind. And that has been obviously less of an issue in LA these last couple of years, given that the Rams offense is often humming. But when the times when they haven't been, from what I understand, they've played less aggressive in terms of that zone match and playing more strictly zone, right? They revert to that bend but don't break style. So how we're going to play on defense may heavily depend on how we perform on offense this year. But I think when we look at these two corners, Okudah and Phillips, I think have, their various strengths and weaknesses, and they kind of mismatch, right? But I think because of their different strengths and weaknesses, like you could keep both of those guys around, and for specific matchups that you want to play more man against this team or more zone against this team, or this team has a big receiver like a Mike Evans and you want Okudah out there versus this team has a more smaller, quicker guy, and maybe Clark Phillips is a better matchup there, right? And so theoretically, both of these guys are worth, sort of revolving door. But ideally, you want a guy that, you want one combined version of that, right? Someone who can marry their skill sets together, right? You want a guy with Clark Phillips' instincts versus zone, someone who has the size and speed to be able to play man and match up like Okudah, someone who's not going to draw flags like Clark Phillips, someone who's going to be able to tackle like Jeff Okudah, right? And I think that player is potentially out there somewhere, And so I would look at Okudah and Phillips as valuable role players, but are either one of them long-term starters? I'm skeptical of Clark Phillips, less skeptical of Jeff Okudah, because I think if you can get Okudah to improve in zone coverage, which again is not guaranteed to happen, but to me, he's going to be much closer to your solution. He checks more of the boxes that you're looking for than Clark Phillips does at this point. And that's what, development is all about, right? We talk about this constantly. Like when players develop in the NFL, it's usually they're developing the mental aspects of the game, which is what we're talking about with Jeff Okudah in zone. It's not really the physical aspects that, get significantly better in the NFL, right? There's a reason why there aren't that many outside corners in the NFL currently that are 5'9", 185 pounds with below average 4.5 speed and T-Rex arms. That is Clark Phillips. Sorry, no offense, Clark. Right? To me, you're basically, if you're betting on Clark Phillips to be a starter for you, especially on the outside, you're betting on an outlier. And I personally don't love that bet. And that's kind of been a through line of the Arthur Smith regime, is they tend to bet on outliers a lot. Too much, maybe. That's part of the positional value arguments against, but at least with like Pitts and Bijan, like, you just watch them for 5 seconds and you're like, oh, I get it. Why you're betting on that guy to be an outlier from a positional value standpoint. Even Desmond Ridder being the 3rd round pick. I mean, again, our bet was, hey, all you got to be is the 19th best quarterback. That's not some awful bet that he couldn't achieve. Right. And as I said, he got like 90% of the way there. Just got to clean up that 10%. But like, this is why, like, I'm a quote unquote Clark Phillips hater, right? Because I just don't see developing Clark Phillips into that outlier to me is not really an ideal goal for me in terms of my vision for the future of this defense, right? To me, what would be a worthwhile goal is if you could have Clark Phillips pushing D Alford next season and he could turn into a really good nickel cornerback. There's plenty of guys that look and play like Clark Phillips that have been successful nickel cornerbacks in a zone-heavy scheme like we think the Falcons might be employing. We talked about this when we drafted him. Kenny Moore and Brian Poole were some of the comparisons I made. Right? Those guys have been successful players in the NFL and played, 5 to 7 years in the league. Kenny Moore was a Pro Bowler. So, like, that to me is my vision for Clark Phillips, not as an outside corner. So, I don't think the solution at cornerback, at least the long-term one, is on the team right now, right? I think Okudah is maybe, a guy that you can bring back on a prove-it deal. We'll break that down, right? We'll also talk about some alternative options, right? Is free agency or the draft the place where the Falcons can attack in order to get that potential upgrade at that cornerback spot and get that sort of doorstop to prevent that door from revolving moving forward? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA, Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on a 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info, claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% match on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial, LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. So wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, and if you continue to make us your first listen tomorrow, we'll probably be talking quite a bit about the safety position, as well as any other pressing stories that may come up for the Atlanta Falcons. But let's talk about what's next for the Falcons in 2024. Now, as I mentioned, I think Alford and Phillips competing for that nickel cornerback spot in training camp. Hopefully, one of those two guys emerges. And as we've seen with D. Alford, he offers some special teams value. If he were to happen to lose that spot, that wouldn't necessarily be the case with Clark Phillips. So he would go back to what we saw for most of this past year and potentially be inactive unless he can improve that tackling and become, a contributor on special teams. Now, the outside cornerback spot, Jeff Okudah, Tre Flowers are both free agents this offseason. Do they return? We'll see. I don't know. Now, maybe the new regime is going to be higher on Jeff Okudah than the old regime seemed to be at the end of the year, given all the explosive plays he gave up, right? If it was me, I would be like, hey, I'd re-sign Jeff Okudah on a 1-year prove-it deal, right? He's not currently listed among PFF's top 150 free agent rankings, so we don't have a clear-cut projection on what his contract would look like that would be. But the lowest cornerback on their top 150 free agent rankings is Sean Murphy-Bunting at 149, and his projected contract is a 1-year, $4 million deal. So I'm thinking something in that range, like a Okudah contract is a 1 year, maybe $3, $4, $5 million, right? That makes sense to me. I think Tre Flowers is worth bringing back. Is a depth guy that can cover tight ends when we play dime defense. The Falcons refuse to do that all year long, trusting in Richie Grant. We'll talk more about that probably tomorrow on how effective that was. But at least with Flowers, he's a good special teamer, a very good gunner on punt team. So, re-sign him on a 1-year veteran minimum contract. There's value in that. Now, Mike Hughes, on the other hand, he is under contract for next year, but, I know Jerry Gray loves him, but I would cut him in order to free up $3 million in cap space. His cap hit a $3.85 million in 2024. That seems too much to be basically the 5th best cornerback on the roster. Now, if you were giving Jeff Okudah a similar amount of money, $3.85 million, at least that makes sense to me, because at least theoretically, Jeff Okudah has the potential to be the 2nd best corner on your roster if you can clean up some things. So, if we're going to pay anybody $4 million next year, I would rather be Jeff Okudah, not Mike Hughes, is basically what I'm saying. So, I think I'm open to bringing some of these guys back, not all of them, but I do think you need to add at the cornerback position this offseason. Now, I haven't done my in-depth research on this year's free agent class. I'm just looking at a couple of guys that have connections to Raheem Morris and Jimmy Lake, right? Do you bring in Akello Witherspoon, who started for the Rams this past year? He's a free agent. Troy Hill's a free agent who started for the Rams in 2022, right? Didn't see any Washington guys that were corners. Miles Bryant's out there, free agent, but he's more of a nickel guy. And I think you have that issue settled with Alford and Phillips. But when you look at the quarterback class, like the top 2 guys are Jalen Johnson of the Bears and L'Jarius Sneed of the Chiefs. PFF is projecting Johnson to get franchise tagged. And, I don't know if Sneed's going to leave Kansas City. But, those are really the only 2 guys that you look at and like, oh, I'll pay that guy. They're on the right side of 30. We can pay them and be a 2 or 3 year solution. But maybe some other players become available as this thing unfolds. And when we get closer to March, and hopefully I've done more research on this upcoming cornerback class, we'll have a better feel of, what that market's going to look like. And maybe there will be more options than those 2 guys. So if the options are going to be limited in free agency, that does leave the door open to address it in the draft, right? We saw the Rams this past year willing to bet on day 3 corners. Darian Kendrick was the starter opposite Witherspoon this past year. He was a 6th round pick. Their nickel spot was split between 2 day 3 guys in Kobe Durant and Quentin Lake, 4th and 6th round picks respectively. Now you wonder, is that out of necessity because the Rams haven't had, a bunch of draft assets to invest and they have to rely on 4th and 6th round picks to start for them at cornerback? That probably has something to do with it, right? At least a little bit, right? But you do wonder if the fact that they were able to get decent results there, does that embolden a Raheem Morris and a Jimmy Lake to say, like, yeah, we can make it work, right? We can make it work with a day 3 guy if that's the case. And they may be forced to do that, right? Because we've talked about a lot of these position groups so far, and we've talked about, reserving those early round picks for the biggest needs in terms of quarterback, edge rusher, wide receiver, right? We've talked about, hey, maybe they should invest, a 3rd or 4th round pick in an offensive tackle or D tackle, right? Because we need to start preparing for life after Grady Jarrett and Jake Matthews sooner versus later. So maybe that leaves the cornerback position in terms of its priority. Well, maybe that has to wait till the 5th round because you just don't have as much assets as you need. So to me, that's the scenario that I'm kind of sitting here, again, nothing written in ink, but sort of penciling in. That seems like the most likely path that the Falcons go down. And to me, that's a path that prompts the team to bring back an Okudah on a 1-year prove-it deal, or bring in a similar player on a 1-year sort of prove-it deal. And so it doesn't feel like this is the offseason that's setting up for the Falcons to find that long-term solution, because they're not going to be able to invest that premium pick, or not to say they won't be able to, but it doesn't seem likely that that's going to be a priority this offseason to invest that premium pick into a corner, unless they, really resolve a lot of these. Again, they go and find a veteran quarterback and, spend money in free agency on a pass rush. Okay, maybe we can actually have a conversation about potentially using one of those early round picks on a corner. But until that happens, right now, it does seem like we'll have to settle for day 3 and another sort of revolving door piece, another stopgap option at that cornerback position. So it doesn't seem like this is the offseason that's set up for the Falcons to find that doorstop, that long-term solution opposite AJ Terrell. We'll see if they wind up paying AJ Terrell. That's going to be a big question. So we still have a lot of unanswered questions at this cornerback position. I think we have enough pieces between, Okudah, Terrell, Phillips, Alford, Flowers, and throw in another body in, a draft pick or another free agent there. And you should be good to go at corner, at least to get through another season, and hope that maybe Jeff Okudah develops and maybe Alford, Phillips take another leap and see where you're at in 2025. And maybe you're in a better position then, right? Who knows? We'll see. But curious to hear what you guys think at the cornerback position. Is this a position that's a priority for you? I know this has been a position that many people for the last couple of off seasons have desired the Falcons to invest a premium draft pick in. Are you still of that mindset, or are you in the let's punt it till next year and then we'll see? Which is basically what I'm telling you I'm at this point. So love to hear your feedback, comment here on YouTube. Of course, hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord. Link in the description below. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. That's a way to provide feedback, or you could become a Locked On Falcons insider at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. Link in the description below. And I think we're going to do another all 22 review of quarterback. 2 weeks ago, we did Michael Penix ahead of the Senior Bowl. I'm thinking about doing Spencer Rattler this week. We'll see. Maybe Bo Nix. Yeah, we'll see. So we'll get to the big names a little bit later. That's probably next week. Might get into Caleb Williams or Drake May or Jaden Daniels. So become an insider, and you'll be able to get access to that, as well as access to all the all 22 reviews, extended all 22 reviews I did during the season, as well as get that one-on-one feedback, priority for upcoming Q&As. We do a lot of those in the off season. It's a great place to submit your questions there, or you just want to vent a little bit about the Falcons, or ask me more, details. You want some of my other stats for these cornerbacks that I did not share on these episodes. So all that's available for you by becoming a Locked On Falcons insider. The link in the description below. But guys, that's going to do it for us here. Check out Locked On NFL, Locked On Chiefs, Locked On 49ers, Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, 24/7 streaming channels here on YouTube, as well as Amazon Fire TV. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every